The shortest and easiest route to Canaan is the great highway that carries trade and armies along the Mediterranean coast. But that road runs through the land of the Philistines. And they would surely attack a band of runaway slaves entering their territory. So God leads his people on a circuitous route. The Israelites turn south toward the wilderness of Sinai. But Pharaoh has not yet learned his lesson.
When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed. And they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" Exodus 14:5.
Pharaoh's heart hardens and he changes his mind. He sends fierce charioteers to stop the fleeing Hebrews.
As the Hebrews began the exodus out of Egypt, the Bible says that Pharaoh changed his mind and chased after them with 600 chariots. It's known from Egyptian reliefs that Pharaoh's rode chariots, but there are no scenes of an army of chariots. 600 sounds like an exaggeration. But last year, in Cantir, in the site of Pharaoh's capital, German archaeologists discovered this stone. It was a tethering stone, a stone for tying horses to. They had found a stable. Then close by they found this, a hubcap for a chariot wheel. This was a stable for a horse and its chariot. Of course, one chariot does not make an army, so they continued to dig. In the end, they found enough stables to house nearly 500 horses and chariots.
This proves scientifically that the large number of chariots described in historical texts are actually true and cannot be dismissed as impossible.
Inscriptions and pottery confirmed they had found the nerve center of Ramses II's chariot force, a state-of-the-art compound for his military hardware. By the end of their dig, the archaeologists found enough stables here alone to house no less than 500 horses and chariots. Confirmation that Pharaoh could well have put together a 600-strong chariot force, which the Bible says led to disaster.
Well, I'm a scientist, so I try to analyze things and I try to go to the bottom with different issues, and the goal for this trip is to look at the Bible text as a book of history, a book of historical events, and that they describe something that really has happened. And then from the text try to understand what what really could have happened.
In the spring of 2000, Dr. Leonard Moeller took part in an expedition through Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula. Moeller is a medical research scientist at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. He is also trained in the field of marine biology. His skills in analytical research, coupled with a deep interest in biblical archaeology, had drawn him to the Middle East on many occasions. Now, as a member of an international team organized by Discovery Media Productions, he had come to the Gulf of Aqaba to renew his search for evidence of the Israelites' Exodus journey. For several years, Moeller studied historical and documentary evidence suggesting Midian as the probable location of Mount Sinai. He realized that to reach the mountain of God, the Israelites would have first crossed a body of water located east of Egypt's ancient borders.
The land of Midian is always on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and the mountain was in the land of Midian. There Moses saw the burning bush, etc. So if the mountain is on the east coast of the Gulf of Aqaba, and if the land of Midian is there, and if all these events took place there, they have to cross some water to get there. And therefore the Gulf of Aqaba is of great interest.
As the right arm of the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aqaba separates the Sinai and Arabian peninsulas. According to the Hebrew text, this gulf where Solomon's ships were harbored was called yam-suph.
Most likely we talk about the Red Sea as the Gulf of Aqaba. We know that it's called yam-suph, which is the Red Sea. We know that King Solomon had his fleet in yam-suph.
This Hebrew name, yam-suph, also plays a prominent role in the Exodus account, for it is used to identify the waters crossed by Moses and his people. The geography of the Gulf of Aqaba also resembles biblical descriptions of the yam-suph God once parted for Israel. Aqaba is extremely deep, plunging more than a mile in some spots. It is adjacent to a dense wilderness of rugged mountains. And it is located clearly outside the borders of Egypt, as recognized during the time of Moses. These similarities to the scriptures have led Leonard Moeller and others to theorize that the Gulf of Aqaba is the Red Sea of the Exodus story. And if they are correct, then two distinct possibilities for a crossing point exist. The first is located on the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, at the Straits of Tiran. This channel, 5 miles across, is one of the most popular recreation areas on Earth, as spectacular reefs and marine life attract divers from throughout the world. But the topography of the seafloor here would have made an Israelite crossing highly unlikely. For less than a mile offshore, a subterranean canyon plunges nearly 1,000 feet at a grade so steep, passage on foot across jagged coral beds would have been virtually impossible, even if the waters were miraculously removed. "70 miles north of the straits, near the center of the Aqaba coast, another potential crossing site extends into the sea. It is called the Nuweiba Peninsula.
This is probably the only place at the Gulf of Aqaba, the western shore, where you could gather as many people as the Bible states that they were.
Satellite photographs of the Nuweiba Peninsula clearly reveal its distinctive geography. This triangular-shaped beach would be the focus of a remarkable search for evidence of the Israelites' journey.
When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country.
For he said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road toward the Red Sea.
If the Israelites traveled from Goshen to the Aqaba coast, then the biblical description of their route to freedom is very specific. They walked a road through the Sinai Desert in the direction of the Red Sea. Only the southernmost road, a trade route that stretched from Egypt to the top of the Red Sea and then on to Midian, matched the biblical description. Located above the peninsula's rugged mountain ranges, this trade route was well suited for travel, as its flat, hard-packed terrain made long journeys on foot manageable and commonplace. When Moses fled from Pharaoh after killing an Egyptian slave master, he would have followed this route to sanctuary in ancient Midian. Then, 40 years later, he led his people out of Egypt over this same desert road again.
And the Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them, and in a pillar of fire by night to give them light, that they might travel by day and night.
By walking through the desert during the cooler hours of the early morning and night, the Israelites could have crossed the Sinai in approximately 3 weeks, the time allowed by the biblical record. The scriptures imply they had a significant head start on the Egyptian army, for many days passed before Pharaoh decided to bring Israel back into captivity. Then, while his army prepared to give chase, he received a surprising report of Moses' path through the wilderness.
Now the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Tell the sons of Israel to turn back and camp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. For Pharaoh will say, They are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in.
This satellite photograph defines the Israelites' unexpected change of course. They had entered a winding maze of dry riverbeds that branched off the southern trade road in a twisting path to the coast. And within this canyon, called Wadi Watir, Moses and his people were hemmed in between walls of rock 2,000 feet high. After walking 18 miles through the wadi, the Israelites caught their first glimpse of the mouth of the canyon and an even greater obstacle that now stood before them. Upon exiting the Wadi Watir, Moses would have assembled his people at a place called Pi-hahiroth. Though its location remains controversial, the meaning of this Hebrew name may point to the site of the Israelites' encampment. For the word Pi-hahiroth translates mouth of the gorges, a perfect description of this beach formed by sand and rock washed through the canyon by seasonal rainfall. From here, according to the scriptures, Moses and his people could travel no farther.
Then the Egyptians chased after them with all the horses and chariots of Pharaoh, his horsemen and his army. And they overtook them camping by the sea, beside Pi-hahiroth. Now, when the Egyptians had overtaken the Hebrews, they also seized on the passages by which they imagined the Hebrews might fly, shutting them up between inaccessible precipices and the sea. For there was on each side a ridge of mountains that terminated at the sea, which were impassable by reason of their roughness and obstructed their flight.
When and if they ended up at this peninsula, then of course they would have been in a very desperate situation. And according to the Bible, Moses didn't know anything what to do. He was completely trapped. The people wanted to kill him, surrounded by mountains. the sea, and they couldn't go anywhere.
At Nueva Beach, the Israelites were surrounded by mountains to the north and south, an ocean to the east, and the Egyptian army to the west. Hopelessly trapped, it is not difficult to understand their anguished cry to Moses, "Why did you lead us out of Egypt to die?"
The people said to Moses, "What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." Exodus 14:10.
At that point, Moses turns to the people and says, "Stand and watch. God will fight for you." So that's one of the primary statements of the nature of this kind of God of war. This kind of God of war fights not with us, but for us. And that's a considerably different and unique theology of warfare that comes across in the Bible.
God says, "Raise your rod so the children may go forward."
Moses does as God commands. As he raises his rod, a strong east wind begins to blow over the sea. The wind rages all night, and when morning comes, the children of Israel witness a miracle. The waters have been driven back, exposing a getaway route. Rejoicing, the Israelites crossed to safety between walls of water held back by the divine power of their God. But as the Hebrews hurry through the parted waters, Pharaoh's army charges after them to its doom. Chariot wheels stick in the muddy seabed. As the soldiers struggle forward, God commands Moses once again to raise his rod. And the waters rush back, drowning the entire Egyptian army.
And the waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen and all the host of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them. There remained not so much as one of them. Exodus 14:28. The Lord is a man of war. Lord is his name. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. Thou sentest forth thy wrath, which consumed them as stubble. Exodus 15:3.
It could be said, however, that this violence is justified.
It seems that the notion of God coming along and helping a people who are oppressed to overthrow the oppressors and march out in victory to come to live eventually freely in their own land, this is really the first time, and maybe in fact the only time, that we hear of such a concept. It's really a great concept, the notion of the God as supporting the quest for freedom and liberation.
The parting of the Red Sea is one of the most famous miracles recorded in the Bible. Believers still celebrate it, while some yet wonder how it could have happened.
The idea that the Red Sea could have parted into two walls of water, as portrayed in movies by Hollywood movie makers like Cecil B. DeMille, is just not credible.
Could such a thing really have happened? Oddly enough, it was Napoleon who first discovered that indeed it could.
At this site in 1799, Napoleon's engineers discovered an underwater ridge some 600 feet wide that extended from shore to shore. His engineers calculated the right time for crossing this 5.2-mile strip when the east wind would blow sufficiently to clear the seabed of water. Napoleon, however, barely escaped with his life when a sudden change in the wind's direction brought an onrush of water covering this strip within just a matter of minutes.
Of course, those were 18th century engineers, and their records did little to satisfy the critics. 20th century scientists, however, have taken up the challenge with surprising results. Dr. Doran Knopf, professor of oceanography at the University of Florida, has developed an experiment to test the viability of the biblical account of Moses and the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea.
We were intrigued by the possibility that perhaps there is some explanation for a similar process. So what we did, we developed what we call in physical oceanography a mathematical model of the part of the Red Sea where many people believe that crossing could have been. Okay, what we have here now is a physical model of the Red Sea. The deep part supposed to represent the main body of the Red Sea, which is about 2,000 or 3,000 feet deep. And the shallow part, with the one with the sloping bottom, supposed to represent the Gulf of Suez, which is much shallower. As we said before, the average depth of the Gulf of Suez is about 100 feet, and the length is few hundred miles. Okay, what we have in addition to this, we introduced here an artificial ridge, which you see right here, and the depth of the water above that artificial ridge is only about 10 feet high. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to let the wind blow from here, and you will see how the water recedes and in fact exposes the ridge to the air. Okay, so what you can see now is that most of the water, in fact, to the left of the ridge is blown away. There is still some water there, and you see that there is an exposed area right there. All right? So the idea is that the Israelis crossed on this part of the ridge which was exposed, and they saw water on the two sides, right? They saw the water on the left side of the ridge and the water on the right side. And I'm going to cut the wind off now, and I'm going to do that abruptly, and you will see how it comes back. So let's do that. And of course, what happens after that is that when the wind relaxes, the water wants to come back to the position that it had before, and it does that via a gravity wave, which moves at the speed we calculated to be like 15 feet per second or so, which is, of course, a speed that one cannot escape.
Dr. Knopf's experiment demonstrates that the strong east wind could indeed have opened a passage through the Red Sea sufficient for the children of Israel to cross, and as Napoleon demonstrated, once the wind stopped, there could be no escape for the Pharaoh's army.
While surveying the subsurface topography of the Nueva crossing site, evidence was uncovered that could help explain how Israel walked from one coast to the other. At its deepest points, the Gulf of Aqaba plunges more than 5,500 feet. Yet the ocean floor off the coast of Nueva Beach rises up several thousand feet from this trench, creating a wide, flattened ridge that the Israelites could have crossed once the Red Sea was divided. Simulated to scale in this computer animation, the view of the Gulf south of the Nueva Peninsula is striking. A chasm, deeper than the Grand Canyon, extends more than 50 miles. Its steep shorelines stand in sharp contrast to the shallow grade of the gently sloping ridge that extends from Nueva Beach to Saudi Arabia. The robotic camera was used to evaluate the physical characteristics of this undersea ridge for the first time.
It's just flat, extremely flat, and very wide. There are no corals, there are no pieces of rock, and we follow that far out in the Gulf of Aqaba. It got deeper and deeper, but it was very flat all the time. And the interesting thing is also that the material on the seabed is not mud, as it is in the Gulf of Suez or at other places. It's a thin layer of sand or silt. It is easy to walk on it if you take away the water, and there would be no limit to have an enormous amount of people there.
Thus says the Lord, who makes a way through the sea and a path through the mighty waters. Come and see the works of God. He turned the sea into dry land, and they passed through on foot.
The existence of an underwater ridge stretching from Nuweiba Beach to Saudi Arabia may make it easier to understand how the Israelites could have crossed the Aqaba Gulf.
Back on Santorini, computer simulations of the enormous eruption show that the collapse of the island would have triggered a mega tsunami, a 600-foot high wave traveling at 400 miles an hour. According to Floyd McCoy, a tsunami expert, it was one of the largest tidal waves in history, and it must have reached Egypt.
We find evidence, believe it or not, on the deep ocean floor. The tsunamis actually scraped across the bottom of the ocean floor in the Mediterranean and disturbed the sediment. We can find that sediment. That gives us some indication of the directions they went. The computer model showed us waves radiating out all over the Mediterranean, reaching the Nile Delta, reaching that whole coastline everywhere.
If you look at ordinary waves, you can see that, for a few moments just before they break, the water withdraws from the shore. A mega tsunami would siphon water from the shore and connecting rivers and lakes, creating dry land for as long as 2 hours. That's long enough for people to walk across. But anyone pursuing the Hebrews would not have been so lucky. By the time it hit the delta, the wave had dropped from 600 feet to 6 feet. But experts believe it would have been 100 miles long.
We should think of a 2-meter tsunami wave like a rapid change of the sea level by 2 meters along the coast. And that can travel several kilometers inland.
As it travels inland, down rivers and canals, the tsunami gains power. Its sheer destructive force could easily drown an army. It would have been remembered for generations.
For more than 20 years, divers and explorers from 3 continents, each intrigued by clues linking the Gulf of Aqaba and the biblical yam-suph, have come to Nuweiba Beach seeking possible evidence of an Israelite crossing. Their search focused on the 600 chariots the Bible says were destroyed in the Red Sea. Inscriptions thousands of years old, and the few chariots recovered from ancient tombs reveal much about the construction of these legendary vehicles of war. Could any of them actually be found on the seafloor off the Nuweiba Peninsula?
The first time I came to Nuweiba, the purpose was to verify, to document, and to establish hypotheses that this could be a link in the Exodus pathway.
Based on his analysis of documentary evidence, Leonard Muller had long suspected the Aqaba coast as the probable location of the Red Sea crossing. In 1997, he heard reports from other divers who claimed to have found unusual coral structures, some resembling the shapes of chariot wheels. Moeller decided to investigate these claims for himself.
The first time I was diving there, of course, we were then looking for possible artifacts. And I had seen on some pictures what we could look for. I was skeptical and excited, because if this is the place for the crossing, then of course that's a big thing. So I was excited about that. But I was also skeptical because 3,500 years, that's a long time. But if Nuweiba is the crossing site, then of course you would expect to find remains of the Egyptian army.
Like others who had explored Nuweiba before him, Moeller immediately recognized the difficulty of this search.
If we assume that a number of artifacts were spread out on the seabed, sooner or later corals would start to grow on them. And of course, if you have a number of layers of coral growing on something, it's very hard to distinguish the structure that was there from the very beginning.
Though the coral complicates any search here, it may have been instrumental in preserving the shapes of ancient artifacts. For coral is a living organism that will not begin to grow on a foundation of sand or silt. Instead, it must first attach itself to a solid object, where it will sometimes conform to the shape of its host.
So for instance, if it would grow on a wooden artifact, the wood would normally disappear in the seawaters after a time. But if you have corals growing on the wooden artifact, the coral could have the shape of the wooden artifact. And then the corals would consume the wooden material over periods of time, but still keep the shape of the wooden artifacts.
During the course of his explorations, Moeller observed that the pattern of coral growth at Nuweiba differed from other parts of the Gulf. Unlike the coral at the northern and southern ends of Aqaba, which often forms large, dense reefs, some covering many acres, the formations at Nuweiba Beach are generally smaller and scattered randomly across the sea floor. Divers familiar with the area have compared the distribution of coral here to a junkyard and the aftermath of a disaster. This description is fitting, and among the strange formations in these waters, many display features indicative of human engineering.
When we dive and when we film at the Nuweiba location, we look for certain structures, and you try to look for 90-degree angles or circular objects, wheel-like structures. So that is what you scan for, so to speak, when you dive. There are situations where you see something that looks like an axle, a hub, something that looks like a wheel, and you say to yourself, this is not a coral reef, this is a coral growth on an artifact. And that is what's different to me when I compare corals at other locations around the world.
Since the earliest explorations at Nuweiba, one distinctive type of formation has often been identified on the sea floor. A slender, table-like structure, sometimes standing on end, with a coral-encrusted base, a straight shaft, and a circular top.
It's a 90-degree angle, a right angle, between something that looks like an axle and the wheel. And you can see this in different varieties, and it looks very different from normal coral growth. And it is like a man-made structure with a coral growth on it.
While most of the possible artifacts found off the coast of Nuweiba are covered with coral, one significant discovery was not.
There is one find at the Nuweiba location that is of great interest, and that is the gilded wheel. It is a wooden basic structure of the wheel and is covered with gold, or electrum. It's a mixture of silver and gold. And corals have not been able to grow on it. It's been very well preserved. Although it's very fragile, it seems like the wooden content has been dissolved. So I mean, you could break it if you would try to remove it.
After its discovery, the fragile wheel-shaped veneer was photographed, then left in place on the sea floor. Later analysis revealed that its dimensions and design resembled four-spoke chariot wheels painted on an 18th dynasty tomb wall near the biblical date of the Exodus. After reviewing photographic evidence and making several dives of his own, Moeller concluded that a more systematic investigation of the Nueva seafloor was warranted. He realized that the limited diving time afforded by scuba equipment would never allow an extensive search of the area. A higher level of technology was necessary, and in the spring of 2000, the Discovery Media team lowered a robotic camera into these waters for the first time.
This has never been done. No one have been in the area at all with a remote control camera.
Controlled from the ship, the camera was maneuvered across the seafloor, transmitting video images for study and evaluation.
We have been down to some 80-90 meters, so we can go deeper down that we can't do with ordinary diving, and we can be down as long as we like.
As in his previous searches at Nueva, Moeller scrutinized the coral for specific shapes.
We can see that because it's a 90-degree angle. You see at the seabed here, there are some structures that are just a little bit above the surface of the seabed. They have a cross-like appearance, it's 90-degree angles, and there's a hole in the middle.
So the hub would be here?
Possibly a hub there, yeah. And the wheel would be a circle around.
This would be the rim of the wheel here?
Yeah.
Okay. So this could be a spoke here, possibly?
Yeah,
possibly a spoke?
Yeah.
What would the diameter of that rim be?
That's a good question, but we would expect it to be about 1 meter, about 3 feet wide.
Okay.
In diameter.
The robotic camera's survey revealed many shapes and objects familiar to Moeller, including coral formations with right angles, arches, discs, and straight shafts, fused into larger masses that had the appearance of twisted wreckage.
Now, when we have been able to go back and forth with a remote control camera, we can repeatedly see that these strange structures we are looking for are there. Not at one place, but you see them again and again and again. And this could be the outer rim of a wheel going around like
The
that.
abundance of these unusual coral structures was even more apparent when tapes of the expedition were carefully scrutinized during the months following the search at Nueva.
Perhaps have a wheel here, standing on the seabed. When you sit and look at these films that has been taken by the remote camera, you see all these strange artifacts or coral growth on some artifacts or structures that appear repeatedly, time after time, at different locations at this spot. And you can sit there and think, well, what is this? This doesn't look like normal coral growth. And it is amazing to see that so many things and such large areas down there that are like a man-made structure.
While the robotic camera logged hours of video documentation, Viveka Pontien and other divers on a second research vessel used metal detectors to evaluate specific structures on the sea floor. Pontien and her colleagues realized that the wheels of many Egyptian chariots were often reinforced with bronze. They hoped to find evidence of the metal encrusted in coral. A scan of this formation indicated a circular metallic pattern around its edge, perhaps evidence of the broken rim of a chariot wheel. Other coral formations examined also contained fragments of metal. Vivica Pontien's interest in this research was heightened by a discovery she had made 3 years earlier, 8 miles due east of the Nueva Peninsula. During her stay in Saudi Arabia, Pontien not only searched for Mount Sinai, she also made several dives in an attempt to document evidence of the Egyptian army on the Saudi side of the Gulf.
And the Bible tells that Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore after they came across. So I figured there must be some stuff on the Saudi side. At one spot there is like a very shallow sort of land tongue going out in a straight angle towards Nueva. You could tell it by the shift of the color of the water. You could see how it was turquoise far out, you know. So I thought this would be interesting for exploration, so we did some dives near to that.
The scattered, irregular coral formations on the Saudi side of Aqaba resemble those previously found off the Nueva Peninsula. In the midst of them, Pontien photographed this circular object attached to what appears to have been a broken axle or hub. This discovery was significant for 2 reasons. Pontien had documented the coral-encrusted form of a wheel with dimensions similar to ancient Egyptian artifacts, directly across from the proposed Nueva crossing site. Her find also provided independent confirmation of earlier evidence establishing wheel-like formations on both coasts of the Red Sea, in accordance with descriptions in the biblical record.
And the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army, and he made the wheels of their chariots come off.
A common question is, why didn't you bring up artifacts? And there are several answers to that. The best thing to do when you find something is just to keep it in position. Document it, but keep it in position. It's very easy to destroy anything. And the other thing, it's illegal to remove artifacts, but also you're not allowed to bring up any corals from the Red Sea.
While Egyptian environmental laws prohibit removal of any coral for scientific dating and analysis, photographic evidence may provide a link to the time of the Exodus. Scholars have recognized that the design of the chariot wheel can be used to identify specific periods in Egyptian history. In the waters of Aqaba, it appears that remnants of 4- and 6-spoke wheels have been discovered. These designs were used simultaneously only during Egypt's 18th dynasty and no later than about 1400 BC, a time frame that coincides closely to the biblical date of the Exodus.